You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Wednesday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Go on over, see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, you can watch this very broadcast right now in video simulcast on my YouTube channel and join the live chat room that's going on there right now over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, before we get going tonight, we kind of wrapped up parts of this series that we are doing on Native America and the conquering of the American West. And we're not done. There's a lot more to go on this. And I've considered taking a break from this and moving into other topics. Yet, I want to keep striking while the iron is hot on this. I want you to keep thinking about these things. Now, I don't do this to make any comparison to anything that's going on in America today. I am looking at history from a pure standpoint of what happened in the United States, how the United States expanded into the West, how the United States became its own continental empire from sea to shining sea, from the Canadian border to the Mexican border, how we did this, and really the growing pains and the atrocities along the way that we committed in order to make this happen. Now, I hold at fault a lot of the decision makers in the 1800s that caused a lot of what we've been talking about. At the same time, I was not one of those decision makers, nor is anybody alive today that was being subjugated by those decision makers. These were parts of the United States history that are not pretty, they're not glorious, they're not right. I cannot apologize for them because I did not commit those acts. I will say that some of the leaders of our past, I have a big problem with the decisions that they made in doing this. Of course, today we live in a country that, without thinking about our history, we take for granted that these 50 states have always existed. And we can see how easily this nation can be overrun by people who think differently. I will say this about all the rioting and all the protesting. There are certain elements of that that are legitimate. That is part of the American experience. That is your right and my right as a citizen to protest the things that we believe are wrong. To go in and find ways to actively participate in making a change in something that we believe needs changing. Do we have systemic racism in our country? I don't think so. Do I think that there are pockets of society that are racist? Yes. Do I believe racism is of the human heart? Yes. It is not of the inanimate system. The system operates by people. If that system has racist elements or oppressive elements to it, then yes, by all means, they need to be looked at and they need to be fixed. We live in a day and age where we should be evolving out of the things of our past. So far we have. There are things that we have done to evolve from the past. Just to take broad strokes at it, the ending of slavery was an evolution for our country. It was bringing into line and consistency the ideals that were written in the founding of this country and our practice. Women's suffrage, the right for women to vote, that came after the freeing of slaves in this country, 1919. Why didn't women have the right to vote? Well, we fixed that problem, and we've moved on and evolved so much more. In any evolutionary process, when we're talking civics, when we're talking society and culture, There are going to be pockets that are doing this the right way, seeing the inconsistencies that need fixing, improving our society, and there are also going to be extremists and pockets of people that want to destroy what is for something that they think is better. That's the problem we're facing today, in a nutshell. And what prompted me to want to say anything about this at all is that I'm doing this series on Native America and the oppression of the Native American peoples in the 18th and 19th centuries, even into the early 20th centuries, the continuing oppression and subversive activities against the Native American culture in the constant undoing of treaties. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, and it was Corin who first brought this to my attention in the chat room, was that the United States Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago ruled in favor of treaty law, saying that the United States must keep its word. And I'm okay with that. It was all over an incident with a man who had committed some kind of illegal act and was being tried, and all of... I'm at a loss for how to phrase this exactly, succinctly and briefly. Being tried for something, and yet it was supposed to fall under tribal law, not United States law, because the reservations are sovereign nations under the auspices of our federal government. And so, no matter what he did, the treaty needed to be adhered to, the word of the United States government need to be kept. And that is what the Supreme Court ruled on. And that is a milestone in Supreme Court decisions. The United States must keep its word. Now, I look at all the crises and all the conflict and all the unrest that's going on nowadays. And it's triggered by... What's funny is it's getting forgotten in it all, isn't it? Triggered by the death of a man who was not a good man. Maybe he had goodness down in his heart, but he was what you would call a petty criminal. And a bad cop ended up killing him. That triggered this whole event after a series of these kinds of things. Does that mean that the police are targeting black men? No. Take all of that and push it aside. I don't want to talk about all of that. That's a whole topic unto itself that would take more time than I have to present the pros and the cons of that. What we see going on in America today is not what happened in the 19th century with the Native American tribes. We wanted their land. We took it from them. We broke our word to them in treaties. They responded to that with their own brand of violence. If you're going to massacre our villages, kill our women and children, then we're going to act in reprisal. And there were many of these, the dog soldiers, there were many of these warriors that said, we will not capitulate. We will live free or we will die fighting, and which is what many of them did. Teresa, over in the chat room, mentioned this morning a scene from Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, a film that was made based on Dee Brown's book of Native American, the suppression of the Native American people and the conquering of the American West. And they made it into a fictional story. And there was a scene where Wavoka, the prophet, in the late 1880s, started the ghost dance. And this is where he said, don't hate the white man. He said, don't act in hatred toward the white man. Love them. Cherish them as your neighbors, but know that the ancestors will come, and they will help us, and the white man will pass away one of these days. Maybe his prophecy is true. By the white man, of course, he was referring to the government of the United States that was suppressing the Native Americans. And in this, he said, let's all stand up together and dance the ghost dance. It was a dance of peace. It was a dance of hope for the Native American peoples. And it was during this dance of the ghost dance that the U.S. cavalry mowed down the followers at Wounded Knee Creek in 1890. That is considered to be one of the last big nails in the coffin to Native American culture in the 19th century. 10 years before 1900 is when this happened. And this is a picture of what we did. This was the final straw that broke the back. There were no more Indian uprisings after that. We had taken everything they had. And then we had killed them for dancing the ghost dance because the government felt that that was subversive. The peaceful ghost dance was subversive because it encouraged the Native Americans to have hope that they will someday regain their lands, that they will someday come back again. And this was a promise of the ancestors, according to Wovoka. So I look at this and I say, there is a delicate, fine line between what's going on now and what happened then. That was the United States taking from a people their land. That was us killing them, raiding their villages. Now, many of those, by the way, those decisions to raid those villages were not necessarily governmental policy. They were the policy of the people that were put in charge of the Indian problem, quote unquote, out in the West. And there were censures that came down against some of these military leaders who led these things. Some were honored and praised. Because after all, we got the territory, didn't we? These are all now, you may live in parts of the country that were once Indian land. We were talking for the last few days about events that were taking place in central Kansas, and Kansas up into Nebraska and Wyoming, the Powder River country, the Sand Creek Massacre. All of these things, the United States government and the soldiers who were there, the generals and colonels in charge of these things, always painted these massacres as a battle. And it was a battle where they killed 1,000 warriors who were fighting the U.S. Army, when in truth, 153 men, women, and children were mown down for standing under the flag that was given to them, saying that this will offer you protection. You fly this flag and stand by it, and you will be protected from harm from the army. It was false. It was a lie. And we saw this happening over and over and over again. And folks, I'm going to tell you something. If you're listening close to these events that we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks, this is the tip of the iceberg. These are the main events that took place. This is not the same thing that's happening today. I saw, what prompted me to start talking about this was, I hear all this talk about the federal government coming in plainclothes uniforms, camouflage, face masks, weapons, and, as people are saying, quote-unquote, kidnapping people off of the streets in Portland. Well, this is something President Trump promised. He said, if the local government will not take care of this problem, not the problem of protesting, because protesting is constitutionally protected, but the problem of anonymous people in masks burning buildings, destroying federal property, destroying statues, things like this, that if the local governments won't take care of it, the president said, look, the federal government will come in and defend federal property, federal buildings, federal statues, and they will subdue those who are, under the guise of protest, committing riotous acts against the people. And you know what? He did it. And all these people that are telling you that these are all unmarked officers and so on is not the truth. Most of them had right on their front plate of their vests and on the back of their backpacks the words police, United States flag on the shoulder. They didn't identify themselves. How many times? Let me state it this way. If you are committing an act of treason, an act of crime, and a cop pulls up in plain clothes and arrests you, that's not unconstitutional. Your rights are not being violated. If you are breaking the law, you can be arrested by a plainclothes officer. Now, what these agents have done, these federal agents, you know who has taken responsibility for this? Unabashedly, they said, hey, this is the U.S. Marshals. This is the Department of Homeland Security. This is the FBI, the CIA, and local law enforcement all teamed up together. Do you know why they're driving unmarked vans? Because when they're driving in squad cars that are marked as police vehicles, people tip them over, they try to burn them, they throw bottles at them and rocks. And so they go in unmarked cars. Minivans instead of Suburbans. Why a minivan? A minivan looks a little more pedestrian. Well, pedestrian's the wrong word if you're driving a vehicle, but you know what I mean. Looks a little more safe. It's a soccer mom van as opposed to a police Suburban. So these things are taking place in order to undercover go in and find those they're targeting those that are causing the problems. Not protesters. It's not a protest when you start defacing government buildings, when you start blowing up government buildings. I had a friend of mine who's a leftist progressive say very proudly saying, when we were younger, what are you guys doing? When we were younger, we were blowing up ROTC buildings and tearing down draft stations, military stations during the Vietnam War. And I said, that's nothing to be really proud of because those are criminal activities. So when a criminal activity is taking place, when they have certain people they are looking for that are causing this, leading this, they have in unmarked vehicles and in camouflage and face masks and marked police with the United States. They've taken people and arrested them. Watch some of the videos. They're not throwing a bag over their head and throwing them in the back of a van. They're standing there, they're arresting them, they're cuffing them, putting them in the van and taking them in under arrest. They are read their Miranda rights, but not necessarily right on the street where they're under the possibility of being attacked by riotous crowds. So they pull them out. These people are getting their due process. And of course, what you hear in none of the detractors is who these people are, save for one or two people that have been vocal about it. They're not telling who these people are. There's one guy that made a big stink about this, and he said he gave all this story of what happened to him when he was picked up, and the police said, we never picked him up. He was never even booked. We have no record of him. And so who's lying? Who's telling the truth? All I will say is this, is if you see this stuff and there's controversy in your head over it, this is what the president promised he would do. This is not, as some people like to say, the jackbooted, brown-shirted Nazi secret police from a Hitler-esque dictator. This is the president of the United States saying, we'll do our best to maintain order in these cities where there are problems and the local government is doing nothing. And they've done that. And it's been very small in percentage. You have people that are saying they've been here for 3 days and they really have done a fantastic job in a very short period of time. That's what Trump said of the law enforcement. They grab a lot of people and they jail the leaders. These are the anarchists. Now, You've got people that are protesting that, screaming about it, having a problem with that, yet they have no problem with their own people that they're trying to defend in committing crimes. This is not revolution. This is riot. So all of this prompted me to want to say what you're seeing today is not the same thing that you saw with the Native American culture in the 1800s. And that's why I can be presenting both of these issues. So I want you to think about these things. Use common sense when approaching all of these things. We live in a country where you have the right to protest and you have the right to petition your government. You have a right to petition your government through your representatives. We are not a democracy. We are a representative limited by the Constitution, a constitutionally limited representative republic. If you have a problem with the way the country is run, you address those things. You don't go out and destroy things. The right to protest is there. This is something the Native Americans didn't have in the 19th century. They didn't have the right to protest. They weren't considered citizens because they weren't. They were looked at as people whose land we wanted, and so we did everything we could to get it. There's a huge difference between these things. And that's a generalized way to look at that. But I want to relate to you the history of how we did what we did. And there were atrocities committed against these people in the 19th century. Being arrested by an unmarked officer for damaging federal property is not an atrocity. It's not the same thing. Everybody in this country, the last time I looked, everybody in this country has equal opportunity to rise above whatever circumstances they have. Now you might say, oh, what about the poor, the slum areas in the major cities? They have the same opportunity I had growing up in North Minneapolis. It takes hard work. But everybody has the same opportunity. There is no oppression. If there is oppression, it is from pockets in our society that still need to be rooted out and fixed. It is not systemic in our overall culture. You look at most people out there, most people have no problems with anybody else rising to the top, no matter their race, their creed, the color of their skin. This is what America stands for. This is who America is now. This is not who we were in the 19th century. This is not who we were at the founding of this nation. There were elements of humanity that were not written into the all men are created equal. But we fixed that. We evolved from that. As I've said 100 times already, our founders were futurist geniuses who knew that they were inconsistent in their founding documents and those problems needed to be eradicated and corrected, which we did. And we're still working on it. The United States is one of the greatest places to live on this earth, despite the blotches on our history. We still have most of the world clamoring to get here and be part of us. There's happiness in all of this. There's goodness in all of this. Just got to see through the thickness of the political ploy that is beneath the presenting of all of this rioting and this information that's out there. There's still goodness here, and it's worth fighting for. So, folks, we got to go out to break. That's the end of our first half. We're going to get into, in the second segment, We're going to talk about Donehogawa. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's a hard name to pronounce because it seems to have so many different emphases on the syllables. Donehogawa. And he was better known in American history as Eli. And we're going to get into him and talk more about him and tell you about his rise and his fall. And you sit tight, and we'll be right back.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
Hey folks, welcome back to the show. Thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you're also watching the simulcast in video on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over, join the live chat room going on right now, and we will dig into tonight's episode. And we're going to look into more about what happened with the expansion of the United States into the American West, which history needs to be understood as the conquest and subjugation and near genocide of the people who lived here. And we're going to look at the rise and fall of Donehogawa. Donehogawa. D-O-N-E, Done, H-O-G-A-W-A, Donehogawa. Now, let's set a little context here for what's going on. It's 1869. This is just a year or so after what we just looked at with the killing of Black Kettle and the subjugation of the people up in the Powder River country. Ulysses S. Grant, on March 4th of 1869, inaugurated as president. And on May 10th, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads join at Promontory Point, and they established the first continental rail line. This was in 1869. And September 13th, Jay Gould and James Fisk attempt to corner the gold market. On September 24th, government dumps gold on the market to force down the price. Black Friday brings financial disaster to small speculators. And that was September 24th. On November 24th, American Women's Suffrage Association is organized. This is 1869. Women's suffrage, the right to vote, is just starting to get organized in 1869. And it took another 50 years before women had the right to vote. December 10th of 1869, the Wyoming enacts a law that gives women the right to vote and hold office by state in Wyoming. December 30th, the Knights of Labor, organized in Philadelphia. Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad is published. In 1870, on January 10th, John D. Rockefeller organizes the Standard Oil Company to monopolize the oil industry. On February 15th, construction of the Northern Pacific Railroad begins in Minnesota. And June population of the United States reaches 38.5 million people. July 18th in Rome, on the other side of the world, the Vatican Council declares papal infallibility, a doctrine of the Church. If you were indoctrinated into the Catholic Church, you'll know what that is. The Pope is infallible. Francis declares war on Prussia. On September 2nd, Napoleon capitulates to Prussia. And September 19th, the Siege of Paris begins. September 20th, William M. Tweed, the Tammany Boss. And if you saw Gangs of New York with Leonardo DiCaprio and others, Boss Tweed was the Tammany Boss in New York. He was accused of robbing New York City treasuries. On November 29th, compulsory education, introduction in England. Production of paper from pulp wood begins in New England. And so although this country was, I'm getting into a quote here now, that's some of the historical context of what's going on now behind the scenes of what we're going to be talking about with Donehogawa. Although, here's a quote. This is from Donehogawa. Eli Parker was his American name. He was the first Indian Commissioner of Indian Affairs in the United States. He said, although this country was once wholly inhabited by Indians, the tribes, and many of them once powerful, who occupied the countries now constituting the states east of the Mississippi have, one by one, been exterminated in their abortive attempts to stem the western march of civilization. If any tribe remonstrated against the violation of their natural and treaty rights, members of the tribe were inhumanly shot down, and the whole treated as mere dogs. It is presumed that humanity dictated the original policy of the removal and concentration of the Indians in the West to save them from threatened extinction. But today, by reason of the immense augmentation of the American population and the extension of their settlements throughout the entire West, covering both slopes of the Rocky Mountains, the Indian races are more seriously threatened with a speedy extermination than ever before in the history of this country. You can see he was an educated man. He was taken as a young boy from his father. They were already being, what's the word? Remember yesterday we talked about how they want the Indians to come in and be indoctrinated into white, civilized culture. Well, he was taken from his family. His hair was cut. And he was, it brings to mind, if you haven't watched Bury My Heart and Wounded Knee, again, this is a fictional, they've made a fictional storyline out of the events of D. Brown's book, Bury My Heart and Wounded Knee. And a lot of it focuses on Eli Parker, Donehogawa. And there is a scene, which I've mentioned before, and I played a clip of it in a past video, where it shows his father dressed in white man's clothes, telling his son he has to go east to go to school. And he's a young lad, early teens. And they cut his hair, they cut his braids, and he's put on a train to go east. And his father is standing, and it's a bitter, emotional moment in the film where his father, who's adapting to white culture, white religion, Christianity, he's standing watching the train go, and he starts singing very softly, Jesus, lover of my soul, because he's trying to hail to this new religion and this new way of life. And in the movie, he's standing there, and it was a fictional event, but so indicative of what many of the Native Americans were experiencing at this time in the 1860s. And he's singing, Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly. And he starts getting softer and mumbling, and he breaks into his own Native American song, grieving for what has taken place, and his son going east to go to school, and their whole culture dismantled and absorbed by United States white culture. I would encourage you to get that movie and watch it. It's very well done. Let's get back into the story of Eli Parker. When the Cheyenne survivors of the Summit Springs fight reached the Powder River country, they found that many things had changed during the 3 winters they were in the South. Red Cloud had won his war. The forts had been abandoned, and no bluecoats came north of the Platte. But the camps of the Sioux and the northern Cheyenne were filled with rumors that the Great Father in Washington wanted to move them far eastward to the Missouri River, where the wild game was very scarce. And remember, they wanted to be on this land. This is their hunting grounds. This is their homeland. This is where they lived. But he wanted to move them east to the reservations. So some of their white trader friends told them that it was written in the Treaty of 1868 that the Teton Sioux Agency was to be on the Missouri River. Red Cloud scorned such talk. Remember that? So we were talking about Red Cloud's war. And when he went down to Laramie to sign the treaty, he had told the bluecoat officers who witnessed his touching the pen that he wanted Fort Laramie to be the Teton Sioux trading post, or he would not sign. And they agreed to this. But it wasn't in the writing. In the spring of 1869, Red Cloud took 1,000 Oglalas to Laramie to trade for goods and collect provisions promised in the treaty. The post commander told them the Sioux trading post was at Fort Randall on the Missouri River, and that they should all go to trade and draw supplies there. And as Fort Randall was 300 miles away, Red Cloud laughed at the commander and demanded permission to trade at Laramie. And with 1,000 armed warriors threatening outside the open post, the commander acquiesced. But he advised Red Cloud to move his people closer to Fort Randall before another trading season arrived. And it was soon apparent to Red Cloud that the military authorities at Fort Laramie meant what they said. Spotted Tail and his peaceful brûlé were not even permitted to camp near Laramie. When Spotted Tail was told that if he wanted supplies he would have to go to Fort Randall, he led his people across the plains and settled down near that fort. The easy life of the Laramie loafers, remember them? These almost comic, quartet of Native Americans that were in procurements, quote unquote. That also came to an end at Laramie. They were all sent packing to Fort Randall. They were in unfamiliar surroundings, and they had to build up a completely new business, a new enterprise. And Red Cloud remained adamant, however. He had won the Powder River country after a hard-fought war. Fort Laramie was the nearest trading post, and he had no intention of moving to the Missouri or traveling there for supplies. Now, during the autumn of 1869, Indians everywhere on the plains were at peace, and rumors of great changes came and went through all the camps. It was said that the new Great Father had been chosen in Washington, President Ulysses S. Grant, Civil War hero. And it was also said that the great new father had chosen an Indian to be the new little father of the Indians, the Indian commissioner. This was Eli Parker, Donehogawa. It's so hard to say that when it does not roll off the tongue well. And this wasn't easy for the Indian tribes to believe. Always the Commissioner of Indian Affairs had been a white man who could read and write. And had the Great Spirit at last taught a red man to read? And a red man to write so that he could be the little father of the Indians? So they found this hard to believe. But in the moon when the snow drifts into the teepees, 1870, January, an ugly rumor came from the country of the Blackfeet. And somewhere on the Marai River in Montana, soldiers had surrounded a camp of Piegan Blackfeet and slain them like rabbits trapped in a hole. These mountain Indians were old enemies of the Plains tribes, but everything was changing now. And when soldiers killed Indians anywhere, it made all tribes very uneasy, as you can only imagine at this point. The Army tried to keep the massacre secret, announcing only that Major Eugene M. Baker, that's a name we heard yesterday, had led a cavalry command out of Fort Ellis, Montana, to punish a band of Blackfeet horse thieves. These are guys that stole horses, which is what the Indians did amongst their own tribes before the white man came into their territory. The Plains Indians knew the true story, however, long before it ever reached the Indian Bureau in Washington, D.C. And during the weeks following that rumored massacre, some strange things happened across the upper plains. In several agencies, Indians demonstrated their anger by holding meetings in which they condemned the bluecoats and called the Great Father a fool and a dog without ears or brains. At 2 agencies, feelings ran so high that buildings were set on fire. Agents were held as prisoners for a time, and some white government employees were chased off the reservations. Now, before you make a comparison to what's going on today, as we talked about in the first segment, this is not the same thing. Today, we do not have villages of people being massacred by the United States Army. We are not stealing people's homes and their land. We are not making treaties with them and breaking them, not feeding them, not giving them things promised in exchange for their land. This is a very different reason that these Indians are angry. When the U.S. Army starts coming into neighborhoods in the United States and massacring hundreds of people at a time, then you might have a comparison to make, stealing their property along the way. Now, because the secrecy surrounding the January 23rd massacre, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs didn't learn about it until 3 months later. Remember, communication was a little slow 150 years ago. And a young Army officer, Lieutenant William B. Pease, acting as an agent for the Blackfeet, jeopardized his career in submitting the facts to the commissioner. He's jeopardizing his career by giving the facts. Remember, the United States Army and these officers out in the plains, they're given totally different versions of events. Oh, there was 1,000 warriors, an uprising, and we had to subdue it, which is nothing like what actually ever happened. So he's jeopardizing his career by giving the facts of what happened. You can't handle the truth. Using the pretext of the theft of mules, a few mules, from a wagon freighter. Major Baker had organized his winter expedition and attacked the first camp in his line of march. The camp was undefended, consisting mostly of old men, women, and children, several of whom were ill with smallpox, a disease that did not exist among the Native American culture until European whites brought it there. And of the 219 Piegans in the camp, only 46 of them escaped to tell the story. 33 men, 90 women, and 50 children were shot to death as they ran from their lodges. All over the pretext, the false pretext, well, perhaps it was true, that some Indians stole a few mules. But they went out to massacre, and they used that as the foundation of their justification for doing what they did. They killed 33 men, 90 women, and 50 children were killed by the United States government. By agents of the United States government, the military leaders out on the plains. Now remember, back then, you were pretty isolated from civilization when you were out on the plains. So they lied about it. And who do you have? You have William Pease, a lieutenant, that risks his career by telling the truth about what actually happened there. Now, as soon as he received the report, the commissioner demanded an immediate investigation by government authorities. Let's investigate this. And although the commissioner's anglicized name was Eli Samuel Parker, his real name was Donehogawa. And he was a keeper of the western door of the Long House of the Iroquois. As a youth on the Tonawanda Reservation in New York, he was Hassanawanda of the Seneca Iroquois. But he had soon learned that the owner of an Indian name was not taken seriously in the world of white men. So Hassanawanda, oh boy, some of the syllables in these names are stacked together, and if you don't speak that tongue, it doesn't roll very well. Hassanawanda changed his name to Parker because he was ambitious and he expected to be taken seriously as a man. And for almost half a century, Parker had been battling racial prejudice, sometimes winning, sometimes losing. Before he was 10 years old, he went to work as a stable boy on an army post. His pride was hurt when the officers teased him because of his poor command of the English language, and so the proud young Seneca immediately arranged to enter a missionary school. He was determined to read and speak and write English so well that no white man would ever laugh at him again. And after graduation, he decided that he would best help his people by becoming an attorney. And so in those days, a young man became a lawyer by working in a law office and then taking a state bar examination. Eli Parker worked for 3 years with a firm in Ellicottville, New York. But when he applied for admission to the bar, he was told that only white male citizens could be admitted to law practice in New York. No Indians need apply, just like no Irish need apply. The adoption of an English name had not changed the bronze color of his skin. And so Parker refused to quit. He was tenacious. He was persistent. And after making a careful inquiry many inquiries as to which of the white man's professions or trades an Indian could be admitted to, he entered Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and mastered all the courses in civil engineering. He soon found employment on the Erie Canal, and before he was 30 years old, the United States government sought him out to supervise construction of levees and buildings. And in 1860, his duties took him to Galena, Illinois, and there he met and made friends with a clerk in a harness store. The clerk was a former Army captain named Ulysses S. Grant. When the Civil War began, Parker returned to New York with plans to raise a regiment of Iroquois Indians to fight for the Union. His request for permission to do so was turned down by the governor, who had bluntly told him he had no place for Indians in the New York Volunteers. Parker shrugged off this rebuff, and he journeyed to Washington, D.C. to offer his services as an engineer in the War Department. And the Union Army was in acute need of trained engineers, but not Indian engineers. The Civil War is a white man's war, Parker was told. Go home, cultivate your farm, and we will settle our own troubles without any Indian aid. And this was the life of General Eli S. Parker, which was written by Arthur C. Parker in 1919. Now imagine that. Here is white culture, the United States culture, putting all the Indians on reservations and telling them you must adapt and assimilate into white culture. Learn the white man's ways. But then when they did, they're being told Indians aren't welcome here. So Parker returned to the Tonawanda Reservation, but he left his friend Ulysses S. Grant, and he let him know that he was having difficulty getting into the Union Army. Now, Grant, for months, needed engineers, and after battling Army red tape, he finally managed to have orders sent to his Indian friend, who joined him at Vicksburg. And they campaigned together from Vicksburg to Richmond, and when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Lieutenant Colonel Eli Parker was there, and because of his excellent penmanship, Grant asked him to write out the terms of surrender. This was at Appomattox. Eli Parker was the man who penned the surrender of General Robert E. Lee to General Ulysses S. Grant, ending the Civil War at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. So during the 4 years that followed the end of the war, Brigadier General Parker, now he's a brigadier general, served on various missions to settle differences with Indian tribes. And in 1867, after the Fort Phil Kearny fight, he journeyed up the Missouri River to investigate the causes of unrest among the Northern Plains Indians. And he returned to Washington with many ideas for reformation of the nation's Indian policy. But he had to wait a year before he could start putting them into effect. So when Grant was elected president, he chose Parker to be the new Indian commissioner. The new commissioner of Indian Affairs, Eli Parker, brigadier general. And Grant believed he could deal more intelligently with the Indians than any white man ever could. So Parker entered upon his new duties with enthusiasm, but he found that the Indian office even more corrupt than he had expected. Imagine that. A clean sweep of the long-entrenched bureaucrats appeared necessary, and with Grant's support, the support of the President of the United States, he established a system of appointing agents recommended by various religious bodies of the nation. And because so many Quakers volunteered to serve as Indian agents, the new plan became known as Grant's Quaker policy. You can look that up in your history books. Or his peace policy for the Indians. In addition, a board of Indian commissioners composed of public-spirited citizens was formed to act as a watchdog over operations of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Parker recommended that this board be a mixed commission of white men and Indians, but politics interfered. Now look at this. We finally won the West, pretty much taken it away, but now we have to have policies in place that are more humanitarian toward the Indians. Now, because no Indian could be found who had political influence, no Indians were appointed. So during the winter of 1869 to 70, Commissioner Parker, or Donehogawa of the Iroquois, as he thought of himself more and more, was gratified by the peaceful condition of the western frontier. And by the spring of 1870, however, he was becoming disturbed over reports of rebellion coming from Indian agencies on the plains. The first inkling he had of the cause of unrest was Lieutenant Pease's shocking account of the Piegan Massacre. And Parker knew that unless something was done to reassure the Indians of the government's good intentions, a general war would probably break out in the summer. And you know, folks, I hate to say it, that's where we've got to stop right now. This is the beginning of Donehogaw's career as the Indian agent appointed by President Ulysses S. Grant, the first Indian agent, the first head of Indian Affairs. And tomorrow we're going to get into a little bit more of his career and how he was aware of Red Cloud's dissatisfaction, and he was aware of Spotted Tail, the Fort Randall, the Missouri River, the Brulés, all of this with the Plains Indians